The man in the White House wasn't hungry, but he was as fearful as any American of losing his job. Herbert Hoover was being personally blamed for the Great Depression. He was an unlikely villain. The name Hoover had been synonymous with humanitarian. He had made his reputation during the Great War. For the starving nation of Belgium, caught between German trenches and a British blockade, Hoover orchestrated shipments of food. Hoover Kitchens, the relief stations were called. But he had no craving for fame and power. Hoover always claimed he was a public servant, not a politician.
Hoover was often seen as a big business Republican who didn't relate to the common man.
He wore those stiff double-breasted suits and the big high collar and so on. And his personal demeanor was quite stiff and reserved, so it was easy to lampoon him and caricature him as a stereotypical big businessman.
Hoover was indeed a businessman, one of an early handful of international capitalists. But he also had a highly developed sense of social obligation.
Herbert Hoover once said that the only trouble with capitalism is capitalists. They're too damned greedy. So I don't think, as we look at big business today and we look at things like Enron and other corporations, that Herbert Hoover would have approved at all. He would have been appalled at those industry leaders and what they did. Ashamed, indeed.
As a Depression president, Hoover was handicapped by his innate lack of charisma. His lackluster public speeches did little to inspire confidence.
What our people need is the restoration of their normal jobs, the recovery of agricultural prices, and of business.
Hoover didn't believe in using direct government intervention to ward off the Depression. Instead, he relied on what he called voluntarism, asking corporations to voluntarily improve working conditions and wages. Hoover had the misfortune of running for re-election in the depths of the Depression. The 1932 campaign turned his name into a permanent punchline.
A Hoover hotel was a cardboard shack. A Hooverville was a collection of cardboard shacks. A Hoover flag was an empty pocket turned inside out.
The summer of 1932 was miserable for Hoover. He hit the campaign trail and tried to put on a brave face.
Wherever he appeared, there were angry Americans with signs critical of him. There were people who shouted, "We want bread." And everywhere he went was the specter of hunger. It must have hurt him tremendously to campaign.
The demand for goods vanished. Assembly lines ground to a halt, and crops rotted in the field because they weren't worth the price of picking. In response to the emergency, President Hoover cut income taxes. It was little help when the tax on an average salary of $4,000 was less than $6 per year. But otherwise, he believed government should leave the economy alone. It would heal itself. Prosperity, he predicted, was just around the corner. That kind of advice had seen Americans through recessions for more than 100 years. But this time, they weren't buying it. Americans turned on the president with a vengeance.
The town that I lived in was a Republican town, and even there you found a breakthrough of people getting disenchanted with President Hoover.
It is one of the ironies, one of the tragedies, in fact, of Hoover's career, that this instinctively progressive man, who had a sense of government as an intervening authority, although a more limited sense than his successor, it's a real irony that Hoover would be perceived as a conservative reactionary president.
Having identified a scapegoat, the country now set about adopting a hero. He would be everything that Herbert Hoover was not: a Democrat, an aristocrat, a consummate politician. A role that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born to play.
He had it. He had charm, charisma.
He just caught on. I don't mean caught on like a movie star or a rock star today. No. We don't experience anymore politicians who catch on. Well, FDR caught on.
What Roosevelt offered was a sense of hope that even if today I don't have enough to eat, or even if today I don't have a job, it will be better tomorrow. Whereas it seemed that during Hoover's administration, it just wasn't getting any better.